Hi, everyone. Today is the date that lives in infamy, December 7th, 2022. And this is a regular meeting, Joe Rosenthal Speaker Series. We're very pleased to have today a wonderful man and a real expert on Pearl Harbor. The attack 81 years ago on the United States that sent this country into World War II. We all know a little bit about it, and today Dr. Gary Laine is going to fill in some of the blanks, and at the end of his presentation today, answer some of our questions about the attack.
Don't do anything.
You all know a little bit about Pearl Harbor. That requires no introduction, but let me introduce our speaker today. Gary Laine, DDS, grew up in Southern California in Arcadia, Pasadena. He attended the University of Southern California, completed his dental degree at USC School of Dentistry, and then continued in a specialty program in prosthodontics, and I'm going to tell you what that is, at USC, and then completed his education, somewhat embarrassingly, at UCLA. Between those programs, he found time to serve in the U.S. Navy Dental Corps at Naval Station San Diego. And his family has 109 consecutive years of experience in dentistry, dating back to 1913, when his grandfather graduated from the Nebraska School of Dentistry. Dr. Laine's father also served in the U.S. Navy Dental Corps at the end of World War II, and he was recalled for the Korean War, at which time he was stationed in France and in Germany. Gary and his family accompanied his father to Europe and lived there during his assignment. And on the trip home, they crossed the Atlantic, sailing on a U.S. Navy troop transport, a voyage the 5-year-old future Dr. Laine never forgot, especially seeing the Statue of Liberty as they came into New York Harbor. These early experiences and connections encouraged his interest in travel and in reading history, leading him to visit many military and aviation museums in the US and Europe, and fill his bookcases with incredible stories of courage and bravery from World War II. Dr. Laine's on the board of directors of the Bay Area Honor Flight, and he continues his dental practice in San Jose. He also continues to tirelessly interview veterans of World War II. And I can tell you just from talking with Dr. Laine, he's the kind of dentist I'm happy we have, but I hope I never need, because he's not an average family dentist. He's highly specialized in complex restorative dentistry for people with lost or missing teeth because of disease or accident or some other misfortune. So I'm happy he's here. I'm happy he does what he does. And here's Dr. Gary Laine.
Well, thank you, Tom. Those kind words were incredible, and I hope I'm worthy of them for today's presentation. And also in regards to the dental, I've heard that before, because patients will say, or people will say, I hope I don't have to visit you because of the complexity that they may have. So as the great announcer Vin Scully might say, pull up a chair and let's treat this as if it's a FDR's fireside chat. Is it going? Okay. So I want to start with mentioning the fact that this is dedicated to 2,403 individuals who lost their lives at Pearl Harbor on this date, December 7th, 1941. The author of From Here to Eternity, James Jones, many of you will remember the movie starring Burt Lancaster, Montgomery Clift, and Frank Sinatra won a supporting actor award. James Jones was a rifleman at Schofield Barracks on December 7th, and he reflected, "I remember thinking with a sense of profoundest awe that none of our lives would ever be the same, that a social, even a watershed had been crossed, which we could never go back over. And I wondered how many of us would survive to see the end results. I wondered if I would. I had just turned 20 the months before." That quote is prophetic, considering how many young men lost their lives on that December 7th. I'd like to give special acknowledgments to Tom and the invitation of the Joe Rosenthal chapter. Incredible honor to be presenting my material before you. To Ron Chen, my dear friend and producer who helped me put this all together. His patience through 9 or 10 rewrites was amazing to get this far. His graphics, I cannot say enough. He's an incredible guy. And also to Terry Ulmer, who's on the call. He's the owner of Mopar Ranch in Alpine, just east of San Diego. And it's an amazing Pearl Harbor, Greatest Generation, and muscle car museum. It's a must-see. Look him up, and you've got to go see him. And much of his some of his artifacts he gave me will be featured. The legacy of Pearl Harbor has many complex chapters, too numerous to cover in an hour. So I shall focus on 10 veterans of Pearl Harbor who I have interviewed via video in person around the country. Their stories will be aligned with the events of that day. And what makes it interesting is the diversity of their backgrounds and their location in the battle. People might ask, how did you get those particular interviews? Well, I say through it's a lot of passion and a lot of work and joy. So how did I get interested in Pearl Harbor? It goes back to 1957, third grade at Highland Oaks in Arcadia, California. And I had a classmate who was reading this particular book, and I was fascinated by it. And I think I asked my mom for a Christmas present, and it was this book. And it cost the grand total of $1.95. And it's hard to believe that looking back 65 years ago, that I read that book, and here I am talking about the topic that it covered at that time. The story of December 7th is a saga of blunders, courage, cowardice, arrogance, complacency, ill preparation, and heroism. This classic book, published in 1980, remains the standard for understanding this subject by Gordon Prange. In 1991, the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I ordered a special edition from the Honolulu Advertiser about December 7th. I did the same on the 75th anniversary in 2016. Ironically, on the eve of the 75th anniversary in 2016, I was looking into my dad's military trunk in the garage of his newspapers and found this incredible banner, December 8th, 1941, LA Examiner. As I have interviewed Pearl Harbor survivors, this particular newspaper accompanied me to those meetings, and each of the 10 who are on today signed that newspaper. So was Pearl Harbor the greatest disaster on American soil? It's a good question. If we look at the fatalities that have happened supposedly in this country, that have happened in this country, there were 620,000 killed in the Civil War, 2,996 at 9/11, and 2,403 on December 7th. Technically, the Hawaiian Islands, they were not part of the United States at that particular point in time, not until 1959. So it does not qualify as the worst calamity on the soil, our soil. But was it the greatest disaster humanity has ever seen? That's another fair question. Excuse me. And I would say the answer is yes. Why? Because it led to our involvement in World War II, not only in the Pacific theater, but in the European theater. The Pacific theater, we lost over 30 million soldiers and civilians. And in the European theater, approximately 15 to 20. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii for 3 reasons. We actually had invaded the Hawaiian Islands in 1893, purchased them in 1898, and there was a reason why, 3 reasons why we did that. One is to acquire a strategic naval base in the Pacific. Number 2 was a gateway to the East and Asian trade. And number 3 was cheap labor. We had both the native Hawaiians, but we had 158,000 Issei, Nisei Japanese that were living in Hawaii at that time. So when World War II broke out, there was no way that these Japanese were going to be deported like those who were on the West Coast, because they were vital to the Hawaiian economy. And so they remained on the islands. By the way, the president in 1898 was William McKinley. So if we look at, excuse me, Pearl Harbor, some will say it's an alluvial fan. Some will say it's a 4-leaf clover, but it's about 45 feet deep. And from the standpoint of strategy, it's perfect for 19th century battleship warfare. But in the 20th century, with the advent of the carriers and naval aviation, any ships that were along the Ford Island battleship row were sitting ducks. And that's ultimately what happened to that on that day on December 7th. 1890, the book was by Alfred Mahan, and it was on sea power. One of the key initiators for sending Japan down the path of warfare was this treaty that was the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, which ended the Russo-Japanese War. Theodore Roosevelt brokered the treaty, and in it, the Russians ceded Korea and South Manchuria to Japan, but Japan was annoyed because Russia was not obligated to pay for the war costs that Japan incurred. So this was perceived as a slight by the Japanese and continued on during the 20th century, particularly with the Washington Conference and other things which we're going to talk about, excuse me, shortly. In 1914, Japan annexed the Caroline Islands and the Marshall Islands from Germany. And in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles mandated the Marianas to the Japanese. These became key military installations for them as World War II came on the horizon, and those were crucial islands that the United States had to recapture, which they did during World War II. As the 1920s roared along, the next step was the 1930s. Of course, we're all very familiar with the Great Depression. Most of the world economies came to a grinding halt in the 1930s. Red lines, poverty, deflation. It was a perfect scenario for the leaders like the Axis powers to extend their influence and control. Also in the United States, we were profoundly adamant about maintaining neutrality, primarily because of the Great War in 1918. Congress went so far as in 1935, 36, and 37 to initiate neutrality laws, which prevented the United States from sending arms to belligerent countries. FDR went so far as to establish a Pan-American zone, not allowing foreign ships to come within those boundaries. And he basically said, shoot to kill. So Roosevelt really was open to the beginnings of war if that ever happened. Also, you had the America First group run by Charles Lindbergh, who was very important in neutrality. But as the election of 1940 came closer to fruition, the American public, at least in a poll, 40% of them thought that if Germany was the aggressor, then the United States should follow. This was not so for Japan. I can thank this slide from Dwayne Lewis, who's on the call. Wendell Willkie, who ran for president in 1940, said in regards to the Axis powers, there are madmen who are loose in the world. And we think of the playing field of dictators and politicians at that time. We'll take a look at Mussolini. He was a school teacher, took control of Italy in 1922, a fascist dictator. Adolf Hitler needs no introduction, a German corporal in World War I, Nazi socialist leader. Then Hideki Tojo, who was took over as the premier of Japan in October of 1940, and a military fanatic. But then we have the Allies, and let's look at these three. Joseph Stalin, and during the Soviet purge, killed more Soviets than Adolf Hitler did the Jews, more than 6 million. And over 18 million Soviets died in World War II, the most of any country. In the middle, then we have the Harvard intellect, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and maybe the greatest Englishman ever, who was also a functioning alcoholic, and you might want to read about his drinking habits, was Winston Churchill. Oops, let's see here. I have a little trouble here. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. In April of, let's see. In April of 1941, the U.S. fleet was moved to Pearl Harbor. This was on the edict of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He felt that the Japanese were presenting a problem as far as potential aggression. The Japanese also looked at that as a move of aggression on the part of the United States, but also a supreme opportunity to possibly ambush the American fleet because they would be all in one position. One admiral, who was the head of the Pacific Fleet at that time, James Richardson, was totally at odds with this move to Honolulu and made a special trip to Washington, D.C. and had a discussion with FDR. Why did we do this? Cost not enough housing, too expensive, not enough to do for the fleet. It was just many problems as far as Richardson perceived. FDR did not agree with that and fired him. And so Admiral Kimmel came on board in February of 1941. If we look at this particular slide here, August of 1941 as a key, at that time, FDR said enough is enough with the aggression. Japan relied on their oil supply 80% coming from the United States. So we cut them off. And so Japan continued their assault down the Malay Peninsula, Indochina, and into the British and English colonies. They were looking for iron, rubber, oil, and tin. It was a significant move, which again forced the Japanese hands. The architect of Pearl Harbor from the Imperial Japanese Navy, many of you know already, was Irasoko Yamamoto. And his first name stands for the number 57 because it was a Japanese custom, at least at that time, for the father, if he was to name his son his particular age. So his father was 57. Yamamoto spent 2 tours in the United States, so he was very familiar with how huge this economy was. He was also quite a gambler in cards, chess, dice, which translated to his military expertise as well. He was willing to take gambles wherever. And he was at odds with the battleship strategy, which was the status quo in the Japanese Navy at that time. He preferred carrier warfare along with naval aviation. So if we look at this map of the Pacific, on November 26th at dawn, the greatest armada in the history of mankind departed for Honolulu. And this was a 3,500-mile journey. They took the northern route, as history has shown, because they would not encounter or be discovered by any other nations. It is amazing today, when you look back, how an armada that size could not have been discovered by any means. Today, they wouldn't even make it out of the harbor, and we would know where they are. There was radio silence, blackouts at night, and our intelligence was very poor, had no idea where they would be. The Quito Batai was called, as the first fleet. 300 ships, 6 of those were the carriers, 400 planes dominated by the Val, which was their dive bomber, the Kate, which was their torpedo bomber, and then the Zeke, or the AM-6 Mitsubishi Japanese Zero. And 16,000 men accompanied them on this trip. There was some concern, though, and on Yamamoto's staff was Admiral Matomi Ugaki. And he stated, what a big drama it is, risking the fate of a nation and so many lives. And historians have agreed that the first bomb that was dropped on Fort Island was basically suicide for the Japanese nation going forward. Another important dispatch was on November 27th, 1941. It came from Harold Stark, the chief of naval operations. And it said that this is considered to be a war warning. Well, there wasn't much emphasis on Hawaii whatsoever in the message. It was more for the Far East and the Philippines. So Admiral Kimmel and General Short were left out in the dark, basically, as many times they would be. And our purpose today is not to discuss about the communications, because there's not the time, but there was kind of a lot of jealousy and consternation going on between O&I, the War Planning Division, and Operation Hypo. The complacency was extremely costly for the United States. So let's proceed to the events of the day. The Japanese brought along 5 mini subs along with their major subs into the war zone. These were about 80 feet long, 2-man operated, and 2 torpedoes. And there were 5 of them all together, and only 1 made it into the harbor at Pearl Harbor, but all of them were destroyed. So that brings us to our first survivor, Ray Chavez. I want to thank my brother-in-law who's on the call, James O'Grady, who was able to make a connection for me. This man lived in Poway, San Diego. When I interviewed him, he was 106 years old. He joined the Navy in the late 1930s and was a quartermaster. And the vessel he was on was called the USS Condor. The United States, prior to World War II, had no minesweepers. So they procured large fishing boats up and down the coast of California, and then enlisted the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Italians into the Navy to help them run these ships. They have wooden hulls, so they were ideal for this type of activity, so that the mines would not be attracted into their hulls and blow them up. So at 3:47 a.m. in the morning, Ray Chavez was on board the Condor, and the Condor noticed a wake from a periscope. They notified the USS Ward, which was in the vicinity outside the gates of Pearl Harbor, the entrance that is, and the Ward came over to investigate and could not find any sequence whatsoever. Not much of a conversation was made. Ray Chavez then on the Condor returned to port. He went home, got home early in the morning, told his wife, "Don't wake me up unless it's absolutely necessary. I need my sleep." At 8 o'clock, when the first wave came through, his wife just happened to be out in the front yard and she saw all this activity. She knew something was up. She ran in and awakened her husband. And once again, Ray goes out to the Condor and he's now involved in the battle. This is Ray when I interviewed him. This individual was later saw service on the USS LaSalle, which is a troop transport. If you know anything about troop transports, they are sitting ducks because they don't carry a lot of armament, and they transport men to various areas, particularly throughout the South Pacific at that time, for the assaults at some of the ones he was involved with were Lingayen Gulf, the Marianas, Kwajalein, the invasion of Okinawa, barely missed being torpedoed to Okinawa, and many kamikaze attacks. Here's a man that had really seen it all. When he was released from active duty, he returned to his landscaping business in San Diego. At 6:45 a.m. in the morning, the ward is still out by the entrance of Pearl Harbor, and this time noticed a conning tower. They fired on that conning tower, they hit it, approached it, and dropped several more depth charges, blowing up that sub. That incident was the United States entrance into World War II. By the way, they went ahead and notified, a message was sent to Naval Headquarters at 14th Naval District in Honolulu, but no serious action was taken. Can you imagine the lives that would have been saved if someone had taken the initiative to follow through on that? There are lots of sidelights in Pearl Harbor, very interesting trivia per se. Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge was the commander of the ward. During the war, he was transferred to the USS O'Brien, and at the Battle of Ormco Bay in 1944 in the Philippines, he was there with the O'Brien. What other ship was there? The USS Ward. The USS Ward took multiple torpedoes and kamikaze hits. The order was to abandon ship and ultimately to sink it. And guess whose ship sunk that ward? It was Lieutenant Outerbridge on the O'Brien, his old ship he had to sink. So on the morning at dawn of December 7th, we can look at the ghost of Mitsuo Fuchida, and he was designated as the leader of the first wave of the 183 planes that would assault the Hawaiian Islands around 7:47 a.m. in the morning. This squadron had the Vals, the Kates, and the Japanese Zero. The Zero was the best plane on the planet at that time at the start of World War II. Manufactured by Mitsubishi, it could fly 1,600 miles, cruising speed of over 300 miles per hour. It was well armed with two 7.7 millimeter machine guns and two 20 millimeter cannons. It was very lightweight. It was an aluminum alloy, very maneuverable. But later on, the United States far surpassed that aircraft. They had no radar, so they honed in on the Hawaiian Islands via the music from some of the radio stations that were on the air. And ironically, the Japanese were not well trained in night flying. This raid would have been far more successful if it had been before dawn, but they had no idea about night flying, so it was always confined to the day. So if we take a look at the strategy, the first wave came in on the southeastern area of Oahu, and the second wave came in around 8:50 on the southwestern side. The one left at 6 a.m., the other one left at 7 a.m. The idea here was that they were going to attack the airfields and Battleship Row. The problem was that there was a screw up in regards to the communication aspect. They had very poor radios, and they did maintain the element of surprise, and that was the famous Tora, 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 which Fuchida mentioned, tiger, tiger, tiger. What was happening was the fighters and dive bombers were to attack, secondly, the airfields, but the torpedo bombers were supposed to go in first to Battleship Row. That didn't happen. There was a 5-minute delay, and quite possibly That alerted us as the battleships witnessed what was going on around them to get their anti-aircraft batteries up and going. There was also a third assault or wave that was planned, but the Japanese decided that was not going to be appropriate, too dangerous. But if they did, the plan was to hit the tank farms where our fuel was for the Pacific Fleet, and also our dry docks, which was essential for repairs, because if we did not have those, considering the number of ships that were just damaged during the battle, they would have had gone to the West Coast and would have delayed our entry back in the World War II considerably. So let's take a look. Can you imagine if you were an 8.5-year-old and you were looking up, say you're at Pearl City, and you see the rising sun underneath the wings of some invading planes? What do you think? Well, here you are. Meet Robert Dunlap. Bob was 8.5 years old and was living in Pearl City. And on that morning, he happened to be outside and he looked up. And I asked him, I said, did you see, how high up were they? And he said they were about 50 feet. So he could see the faces and the eyes of these pilots as they flew by. He then, with his brothers, went to an elevated area where he could see the action, what was happening. So he saw what went on for the entire battle as far as the ships being bombed and everything else. Can you imagine seeing that as an 8.5-year-old? Ironically, his father, who was working one of the buildings at Pearl Harbor, was injured severely by Japanese gunfire and spent years in and out of hospitals. Bob later went on to join the Air Force. He was in the Korean situation stateside. He was at Edwards Air Force Base, and he got to work with the likes of Chuck Yeager and some of the early jet test pilots. So a kudo to Bob. And I asked Bob, I said, as part of the issue, did you have gas masks? And he said, yes. And I'd also interviewed another civilian. And as the war went along, the children considered these kind of as a joke. And so they take their school supplies and put them inside the mask and go to school with these. But this was issued by the local municipality. Martial law went into effect at 5 o'clock on the night of the 7th. All bars were closed, and the houses of ill repute were then turned into urgent care centers for a while. And then the government, after that situation quieted a little bit, went back into the business of quasi-prostitution, which is another story we can talk about at another time. So now let's take it to as if you were a pilot coming in. This Japanese Zero is the view. It's coming into Ford Island. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the idea was that they would hit the Naval Air Station here and then other airfields on Oahu, such as Hickam, the Kaneohe station on the other side. And but that was to be behind the battleship row where they were supposed to hit those. Here you've got the California, the Oil of the Oshio, you've got the Oklahoma, the Maryland, the West Virginia, the Tennessee, the repair ship, which was probably one of the most famous repair ships of all time, the Vestal, which was a port side to the Arizona, and following that was the Nevada. And over here is we're going to talk about in a minute, really an insignificant ship, was the Utah. One thing we want to make clear is that on November 28th, the Navy set out the Enterprise and the Lexington to deliver planes to Wake Island and Midway. There was one other carrier we had, Saratoga, and that was in port in San Diego. Well, when the Japanese came in, they mistook the Utah for the Enterprise, and they were told not to bomb that particular ship. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. And so as it turned out, the seaplane station at Ford Island was the first to be bombed. And they did a really good job too, because they destroyed at least 33 of our aircraft. And we were diminished as far as our ability for scanning the Pacific prior to the attack, because we needed to look for where the fleet was. We didn't have enough of these. They were either, a lot of them were requisitioned out to other countries. And we'll talk about in a minute how important that plane really was. So this is the PBY. This is patrol bomber made by Consolidated, a phenomenal aircraft. It had the ability to fly for 16 hours, 2,500 miles. Very useful in anti-sub, rescuing men at sea. And these planes should have been in the air a lot more than they were prior to the war. But all they did was really circle around the southern portion of Oahu, and they should have been arcing significantly out for a greater radius to find where those ships were. So now let's meet another survivor, Chuck Kohler, VP 23. He was a part of a PBY squadron at Ford Island. Amazing man. On the morning of the attack, he was up in Building 58 on his typewriter, typing a letter to his mother when he contends the first bomb went off behind him at the building and just crushed the glass windows, blowing them out. And he had a fair amount of them in his skull, as a matter of fact. He was rather stunned. He goes downstairs and he's wondering what's going on. And so as he's running out, he runs into an officer, and the officer commands him to go to a protective ditch between buildings for protection. He thought to himself, he ran about 5 yards and he said, "To hell with this." He said, "I'm not a coward. I'm a patriot." So he disobeyed orders. He ran through the building, picked up another PBY sailor, and they looked for an ammo cabinet and broke it open and took two 50 caliber machine guns. They then ran across the tarmac, being strafed by Japanese Zeros who came over, and they found a grounded PBY, entered the plane, and there were these two bubbles on both sides of the planes, and they proceeded to install those machine guns and start firing at the Zeros that were coming over and the Vals. They didn't hit anybody, but nevertheless, they put an effort in. The second wave came over, and it was the same situation. When I did my interview with him, he looked at me and he recited a poem that he'd written. And he says, "This is for the 2,403 who died that day." And it went on for about 3 or 4 minutes. And when I was done, I can't even imagine the emotions and the tears that came as a result of that. One of the most incredible interviews I've ever had the opportunity to be a part of. He later served, he was an aviation machinist mechanic. He later served in the South Pacific, again with the PBY squadrons. The next up, and his name is Jack Holder. Jack turns 101 on December 13th. I met him at Pearl Harbor last year at the 80th anniversary. I said, I have to interview Jack. So Jack was also in that VP 23 squadron. And he remembers that day that he was running to a ditch as well. And a Japanese Zero missed him by about 3 feet. And he looked up at that pilot, could see his eyes. The guy was smiling. So he had first prime seats of watching the disaster that went on in the bay that day at Pearl Harbor. He later, then as part of a PBY squadron, was at Midway. And his plane was the first to observe the wake of the Japanese fleet and send an effective message to the Yorktown and also the Midway atoll. And that helped us, tipped off our fleet to attack the Japanese. He also was at Guadalcanal, and he also was flying anti-sub patrol over the English Channel at the end of World War II. I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing him in Arizona this year. Next man up, Ed Carroll from the center of Utah, 98 years old. He was also a part of the PBY squadrons. And at the time when the war broke out on the 7th, he was not officially in the Navy, but he was stationed in barracks that were on the west side of Ford Island, right near the Utah. He remembers seeing the capsized USS Utah. Well, needless to say, as he's sleeping, the gunfire, bombs started hitting the barracks. He got up in a hurry, put on his skivvies and headed out. And he spent the next 5 days, as he recalls, in a machine gun nest swatting mosquitoes, because there were a lot of them that night. He then went on to the, and as part of a PBY squadron, he went out to the Pacific, and he flew several missions. It was at Guadalcanal, and he was also a co-pilot. And there was one story he told me where his plane was shot down, headed into the ocean. Everybody was survivors were there, were healthy except for the pilot. The pilot was severely injured, so Ed pulled the pilot out as before the plane sunk. Talk about the greatest generation, which is inspiring to hear their stories besides their military careers. He went to Long Beach afterwards and started a small trucking business. And over the years, he told me he drove one truck 2 million miles and probably put in over 3 million miles driving across our country. He's an amazing gentleman. I called him last night, left a message. I hope he's on the call today. So now let's talk about the USS Utah. The USS Utah, as one of our individuals talked about, was a disguise because it looked like the platform of an aircraft carrier, but it was a very old battleship, and the United States Navy used it strictly for target practice. And it was the Japanese confused that with the Enterprise, which I discussed earlier. So on 801, the Japanese came in their torpedo bombers and put 2 torpedoes into the hull of the ship, and it capsized in a matter of minutes. Another survivor, meet 102-year-old Warren Upton, the last of 3 survivors off the USS Utah. On that morning, he was asleep as well. The torpedoes came in. There was call to abandon ship. Unfortunately, the Utah was fairly close to shore, and many of the naval sailors were able to get off the ship, and they swam a short distance. There was a problem, though, because the Japanese planes came back and strafed many of the soldiers or the sailors, but they did make it back. Unfortunately, there were 58 sailors that were entombed in were killed that day. 54 are currently entombed in that ship. He went on to serve on the USS Castor with distinction in the South Pacific. Today, this is the memorial to the USS Utah. You don't get there unless you're with us, have special clearance. It's one of the 3 memorials besides the Arizona and the Oklahoma that are at Pearl Harbor. And they chose not to resurrect this ship following the 7th because it didn't provide much value to the United States Navy. Let's talk about torpedoes. One of the problems at Pearl Harbor was the depth of the harbor. It was 45 feet. Studies that were done by the United States and Great Britain said you had to have at least 65 to 75 feet for a torpedo to be effective, because once it hit its dive and it came up, you needed that clearance. 45 feet was not enough. It would probably dive right into the mud and become a dud. So during the training process, and historians have written about this, so it's nothing new, the Japanese practiced, and they decided that, or developed, pardon me, wooden fins to be placed on the tails of those torpedoes. So when it hit the water, it controlled the depth of where it was going. And as the head was ignited, then it would go right on into the target. And so the Japanese were very adroit at doing that. Now let's go to the oldest ship in the Navy at that time, on Battleship Row, the USS Oklahoma. Commissioned in 1915, it never fired a shot in all its service other than in practice rounds. At 7:56 in the morning, the first of 9 torpedoes hit the port side of the Oklahoma. Inboard was the Maryland. And the concussive force and noise was incredible. It was, I've been told. And here's a picture. It didn't take long for about was 12 minutes when the Oklahoma rolled over to the port side and capsized. There were 429 sailors trapped inside that ship. There would be only 32 saved over 3 days. Now, how do they try to get these sailors out? Well, they started with acetylene torches to try to cut holes in the hull, but there was a problem with toxic fumes, which would kill those who were captured, trapped inside. So they went to a more laborious source of using pneumatic tools to try to cut the holes into the ship to try to rescue them. Meet David Russell, Seaman First Class. He was on board the Oklahoma. His living quarters was the main deck. And on the morning of the attack, there was a call suddenly by Lieutenant Rommel, who announced, "This is an air attack, and this is no shit, fellows." And under attack, he was supposed to go down below the armor deck. But as he went down, he thought better of it, because there's a term called dog hatching. And these are these hatches that connect the decks. And so they were being closed routinely because they're a means of anti-flooding of the ship and preventing the water to rise to different levels. So he was fortunate, as he continued his trek up to the main deck, of getting through these hatches to the top side to safety. And he said that the concussive forces of those torpedoes were absolutely deafening. So as the ship rolled, he climbed onto the starboard railing and he reached out to a water hose, which was from the inboard USS Maryland. And hand over hand, he was able to pull himself onto the Maryland. As the events settled down, he went over to the administration building on Ford Island and witnessed the injured bodies and dead bodies that were lined up like cords. He was soon to find out on the second day that he had an uncle. Well, he knew that he had an uncle on board the ship, and he wasn't sure whether his uncle had survived. Well, he was over in another administration building at Pearl Harbor on the third day, and he was talking to his another uncle, was at Hickam Field. And he looks over, and here comes his uncle, who had been on the Oklahoma. He was one of the few that was able to get off the ship. Dave would later go on to serve on the USS Mahan destroyer, which was awarded 5 battle stars in the Pacific, performing at Coral Sea and the Gilbert Islands. Ironically, the Mahan was torpedoed at the Battle of Ormoc Bay in the Philippines, and Dave was the last of 3 men off the ship. He hit the water and was rescued. What was the date? December 7th, 1944, 3 years to the date. This ship really needs no introduction. We've read about it for years. It's the USS Arizona. It's the shirt I wear today. Very proud of that. I even built the Arizona when I was a kid with a Revell modeling system. It was part of the Pennsylvania class, launched in 1915. It had 4 turrets, two aft and 2 in the stern. And if you'll look here, it also carried the Kingfisher. A lot of the battleships did that. These were patrol planes that were launched for search and rescue, to search and rescue. It was quite a laborious process to retrieve these when they returned to be brought back on the ship. We can discuss that at another time. So the time frame, again, is at around 8 o'clock or shortly thereafter. The Vestal on the port side, which you can see here, was actually a wall for the Arizona, because the Vestal had planned to do some repairs on the Arizona before it went to the West Coast. No torpedoes, there's no evidence that a torpedo ever hit the Arizona, but it was the aerial attack from the high-level bombers from 10,000 feet. And they were dropping armor-piercing bombs. The first one hit towards the stern on turret number 4. It went through 3 decks and exploded. Then there were 2 more on the port side. And then the roundhouse was at turret number 2. And this one went through 5 decks, and it went clear down to the powder magazine room, setting off 1 million pounds of gunpowder and hundreds of thousands of pounds of ammunition. And here's this classic picture of the Arizona listing after that explosion. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you the significance of that explosion. And to give you some idea of the geography here, here was the Arizona and the Vestal right in this portion. And again, if we go back, the Utah was on the western side of Ford Island. So let me spend some time on this individual. There were 335 survivors off the Arizona. There are only 2 living today. You're looking at one of them, Lou Contour. He's 101 years old in September. The other survivor is Ken Potts. I tried to interview both of them. Ken Potts lives in Provo, Utah. Lou Contour lives in Grass Valley. I did not get to interview Lou, but I got a meeting with him for about an hour, and it's something I'll never, ever forget. He was one of the last 2 survivors, like I said, of today. And he was a quartermaster, 3rd class, reached that rank on the Arizona. He boarded when he boarded the Arizona in 1940, where was his duty station? Turret number 2. So it's good luck that he wasn't in that particular area when the bomb went off at number 4. Fortunately for him, he was able to secure the quarterdeck and was supposed to be at the bridge on when that attack occurred, but he was actually further back on the ship for him, turret number 3. He saw that bomb blast at turret number 2, and he said that the bow of the ship flew up about 30 feet in the air and came down just as quickly and separated from the hull of the ship. 1,177 sailors died in a matter of seconds. The plume of fire escalated up to about 500 feet. For the next 3 days, the activities on what remained on the Arizona, Lou was in charge of taking care of injured bodies, was on a motor launch taking bodies out of the water. They gave him a break. He's also doing firefighting where the flames created a temperature of 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit. They then gave him a break, if you will, some liberty. He came back shortly, and then he was assigned to a detail with a primitive air hose and helmet to go below the water and into the bowels of the ship and recover dead bodies. I mean, there was no end to the talents of this particular individual. And by the way, it took 5 days for that ship to cool down. Ironically, he should have never been on the ship on the 7th because he had passed his pilot's license to become a PBY pilot, and he was scheduled to go on the 7th to leaving on the lure line, luxury line to go to the West Coast. But his captain overruled that and said, we're going to the West Coast on Sunday, wait on board. And as luck would have it, he saw the attack firsthand. If I might add too, he flew Sky Raiders in the Korean War, over 20 missions. And in the 50s, the federal government asked him to develop a protocol for how to survive as a POW, which exists to this day. There is no end to the talents of Lou Contour. And I might add too, when he was a PBY pilot in New Guinea, he was shot down twice. And one of the times there were sharks circling around him in the ocean, and he survived. I'm going to add one more thing about him because he believed in the 3 principles. I have his book sitting right next to me as I speak. He said, believe courage means that no matter the danger or the fear, one should enter into every job no matter what. Do not panic, never, or you are dead. Remember where you are. I believe commitment means get the job done no matter what. And that's pretty typical of that greatest generation. So, and today Lou Contour was on Fox, and he's to be celebrated. Ironically, and maybe not, say tragically, there were 73 blood relatives on board, brothers. 63% or 63 of those died, a percentage of 86. And you can read this in the book, Brothers Down. So now let's meet our next survivor, Ed Johan, lives in Oregon. Honored to meet him and interview him. His father worked for 30 cents an hour in the Depression in a processing plant. Ed did that as well. did not enjoy school and decided, I'm dropping out of school. And he did so at age 17, and he joined the Navy. Well, he was assigned to the USS Wright prior to the attack at Pearl Harbor, but he was at Pearl Harbor. Well, in those days, there was typically the military, if you hadn't had your tonsils removed, you needed to have that done. And so he was ordered to the USS Solace, which is the hospital ship at Pearl Harbor. And I asked him, I said, how was that? Did they line you up kind of like getting a haircut? No anesthesia, just get in there with the instruments and just rip those tonsils out? He said, yep, that's what they did. And so as he's healing, he was then charged to be part of a motor launch crew that would transport officers, enlisted men around Pearl Harbor while he was healing. Well, on December 7th, the 17-year-old's life changed dramatically. His motor launch was now pulling bodies off the Arizona, the West Virginia, and the Oklahoma. And out of that water, these individuals were covered in oil. There's the picture of the Solace, and there's the picture of the motor launch. Torpedoes sped by, and he was fortunate to not get hit by enemy gunfire. He described looking at the faces of these sailors, blank and forlorn, some of them dead, pains of agony and shock. As he pulled these bodies out of the waters, many times the skin was just peeling off the corpse. He later went on after this experience to back out to the USS Wright and served with distinction in the South Pacific. His post-war career, he was a prize fighter, lumberjack, and mountaineer, and he climbed Mount Hood an incredible 72 times, including bringing up some blind kids at one point. So when you go to Pearl Harbor, they just have a particular visitor center. It's just amazing the information they provide. And this is a plaque here. So this describes the second wave, which came in at 8:54 a.m. The wave was void of the torpedo bombers. It was strictly Vals and Zeros that did the damage. The star of the show, if there is one, was the USS Nevada. It had been struck by one torpedo in the first wave. And it was the only battleship that attempted to get underway up the harbor. And it was called the Cheer Me Up ship because everybody else was devastated. And they were doing a good job of it until five more bombs hit that ship. And it was forced to go to Hospital Point and basically stay out of the action. And can't think of the word right now because I've got a lot on my mind here. But anyway, that ship served as an impetus for the fight and courage. Let's meet Mickey Ganich. Mickey Ganich was the 12th of 14 children. He joined the United States Navy and was on the ship, the USS Pennsylvania. You'll see the arrow right there. On the day of the attack, fortunately for him, the Pennsylvania was in dry dock and was being repaired. The two ships that you see in front there are the Cassin, the Downs and the Cassin. Those are two destroyers. Both of them were destroyed during the second wave, but they were resurrected and returned to battle. On the morning of the attack, the USS Pennsylvania and the Arizona were going to be playing for the football title of the Pacific Fleet. So Mickey and some of his crewmates had their football uniforms on when there was a call to alarm. So his job was crow's nest. The crow's nest is about 80 feet above the deck. And so he scrambled up to the crow's nest in his football uniform. He had a front row seat, saw what was going on. When the first wave departed the premises, he shimmied down the ladder and back to his headquarters, and they put back on their uniforms, thinking that the Japanese might return. And sure enough, the Japanese returned again. There was a call to alarm. So as he's running up that ladder to the crow's nest, shimmying up, he saw the Japanese Zero come through and started strafing the step ladders as he was going up. He was very fortunate to have not been hit, but it was a close call. While he was up top on the crow's nest looking, the only bomb that hit the Pennsylvania hit the midships. Fortunately, there was no damage done that was significant. And interestingly enough, the Pennsylvania would serve with distinction, not interestingly, but with a tagline in just a second here, throughout the Pacific. Mickey was with that ship the whole way until it was finally sunk in 1946, and he was part of the atomic testing at the Bikini Atoll. So Mickey saw it all. And Mickey unfortunately passed away earlier this year. The numbers, just to review, the United States through the military and civilian lost 2,403. The Japanese, only 185. And if we put up aircraft and ships and the like, the Japanese lost only 29 planes that day. This is a t-shirt that I proudly wear, not this one, but another one. This is to show you that the question was asked earlier, did any of these ships return to battle? The only ships that did not were the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the USS Utah. But the Nevada, the Oklahoma, Maryland, Tennessee, and West Virginia, and California all did within a period of a year. And we have to give an applaud to Captain Homer Wallen, who was part of the salvage process. And it's incredible to read the story, which a lot of articles have been written about the salvage of these particular ships. The Nevada, interestingly enough, returned to action at D-Day, later at Okinawa, and the West Virginia participated in the closing ceremonies in Tokyo Bay and the signing of the treaty to end a war. I was at the FDR Historical Museum recently, and this kind of came up because I know about his smoking habit. It probably helped kill him along with his heart disease, but it's going to be important here as I talk in just a moment about FDR. So the afternoon of the attack, right afterwards when he heard about it, he called up his cabinetry and they came to the White House to discuss what was the next move. And interestingly enough, FDR began the work of his famous speech about 3 hours after he heard about the attack. And he dictated it without notes to his assistant, Grace Tully. And each word was spoken incisively and slowly as he took a drag on those Camel cigarettes. Typically, Samuel Rosenthal was his speechwriter. He made only 2 changes in the first sentence. And you can see at the library, they have copies of this, which it shows you the extent of corrections on it. Probably the most important speech, potentially, of the 20th century because it exhibited his vision and leadership. And interestingly enough, he needed to be transported to Capitol Hill. His wheelchair would not fit in his limousine. Many of you probably know this story. So the Secret Service came to the rescue, and they just happened to have impounded Al Capone's Cadillac. So within 24 hours, they were able to fit the Cadillac with his wheelchair, and he went to Capitol Hill in Al Capone's Cadillac. He arrived and went to the podium at 12 noon, and here's what he said on that first sentence. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. And on he went, and it took him about 7 minutes to complete that speech. So Admiral Yamamoto said that the Japanese would run wild for about 6 months, but he knew that they had awakened a sleeping giant. And that and the Japanese were drunk with victory disease, because that's indeed what happened for 6 months. But then the hammer came down, and you can pretty much read this, but our defense spending, as far as the gross national product in 1939, was 1% of the budget. In 1945, it was 94%. So for us to defeat this small nation, it took a while, but we certainly had the might. So as I close up, the Arizona Memorial was opened in 1962. It's run by the National Park Service, and many of you have been there, the shuttle launch takes you out there, and you have 10 minutes on the memorial. It's a very somber place. I know every time I go, I break into tears being a Navy guy. All 1,177 names are written on one of the inside walls. When we were there that day, the timing was amazing, because you'll see the flag was at half mast, and because Senator Robert Dole had died the previous day. And there's a reason why there are 7 windows, because it was the 7th day, December 7th. So I hope you can appreciate the heroic efforts of these incredible men that I've just exhibited to you today, and their roles in the attack and beyond. And maybe in the years to come, please look at each December 7th and give thanks to the 2,403 military men and civilians who lost their lives. It certainly was an honor to attend the 80th official ceremony, as I did last year, and watch those veterans make their final salute for the morning. The sun had been raining extensively. The sun came out, illuminating them, and in the background was the USS Missouri and the USS Arizona. So again, I want to thank you so much for your attention. I hope it has been worth your while today. This is a passion for me, and it was an honor to be able to present my information. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gary, very much for being here, for all your knowledge, all the time you spent collecting those interviews, and the time you spent preparing your presentation for us today.
You're welcome.
I'm sure we have some questions. PT Brent in Honolulu has the first question.
Gary, I wasn't good enough to be in the Navy, but I'd have to say bravo Zulu. One of the best presentations I've ever had, and I've been to many, many things on Pearl Harbor. Bravo Zulu, well done.
Wow, I'm blown away, Brent, because I try to bring a personal aspect to it, as opposed to a lot of what you read, and having these 10 really brought it to life to me. I know Tom said, of all the stuff you've read, and what has created the greatest impact for you, and it was hearing these stories firsthand for people who experienced it. So thank you. I'm very grateful.
That was also quite an FDR. Quite an FDR.
Great.
I've been working on that one.
You almost had me.
There's a lot of voice inflection. You have to understand how he clipped that first sentence. So thank you.
You know, if I was FDR, I'd have a lot of martinis also.
Not too many cigarettes, though.
What?
He loved to smoke cigarettes, so I don't do that.
That was his bond with Churchill. They were both high authority drunks.
In fact, while you bring that up, if we have a minute, there was the Arcadia Conference in December, and Churchill was requisitioned to come to the White House for 3 weeks, and Eleanor Roosevelt couldn't stand the fact that Franklin would be around Winston because of the influence of the drinking habits.
Right.
And for Churchill, he would start drinking at breakfast. I forget what it was, like a beer. Then lunch would he graduate to champagne or whatever. And the dinner hour was cocktails and probably an after dinner liqueur. And I mean, he was really a functioning alcoholic to a certain extent. the thing about Roosevelt, he liked to mix his own drinks. And when he gave one to Churchill, Churchill would conveniently get up to go to the bathroom, take the drink with him and toss it.
Uh-huh. You know, I've done the same thing at Marine Corps events where they everybody line up and take shots, and you have to all line up and knock them. You know, and I lower it to my side and dump it on the carpeting.
Yeah.
Semper Fi.
Yep. Pat, you had your hand up next.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Gary, I'll see you later, but I have some additions to your wonderful story today.
Perfect.
And I'm so pleased that you gave this history. And I think that maybe you can comment on what I have to add, because I have talked with several survivors in this ordeal on of the day that lives in infamy. So I look forward to seeing you Friday.
I'm going to say, for those of you who don't know Pat Pattison, he's a friend of mine. I interviewed Pat. He turned 100 years old. He'll be, you're 101 now. And he flew in the Aleutian Islands. He flew both the PBYs and he flew B-20, the Ventura. And he definitely he had 3 tours up in the Aleutian Islands. And it's always a pleasure to get together with you, Pat. I look forward to Friday afternoon. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll see you.
You bet.
Thank you, Pat.
Tom,
Go ahead, Jim.
hey, Gary, can you see this hat I'm wearing?
Yes, I can.
Tell me what it says.
Wait a second. U.S. Marine Semper Fi.
It's Mad Cats VP-63.
There you go.
My father saw the first bomb drop on Pearl Harbor. He was a PBY pilot at Hospital Point, and his job that morning was to make sure the Coke machines were filled up in his hangar.
No kidding.
He
Wow.
was waiting for the launch to take them over. Everybody in the Joe Rosenthal chapter has heard this story 10 million times.
Wow.
I think it might be something at some point in the future you might want to add to your presentation. I've got photographs of my father, and he told me the story of what happened. He looked over his shoulder and he saw a plane skimming the water coming towards him. And he said to his friend, he had 2 friends standing next to him, and he said, that plane's flying kind of low. It kind of confused him, because he said our own planes practiced dive bombing the ships on Battleship Row, but they'd come in at 45 degree angles or whatever. And this plane was skimming the water, and it flew right over his head, and then it banked right towards his hangar, Chuck Kohler's hangar. My dad and Chuck Kohler were in the same squadron, but they didn't know each other.
Really? Wow.
And I got the whole story, and I'll get it to you if I get your email address or something, and I'll send you whatever you want.
Oh, that'd be a treasure.
Listen to this. So as it approached the hangar, my dad said the story the way he shared it with me, and they've got it at the at Pearl Harbor at the museum there. The docent came over when my dad was sharing stories with everybody, and he wanted my dad to write it all up and send it back to Pearl Harbor, which he did. But he said, as he saw the plane approaching his hangar, he said a little black dot came out from under the wing. And he said to his friend standing next to him, he said, that guy's in trouble. He should be dropping that sandbag on the ships, not the hangar. Okay. And the next thing that happened was the hangar disappeared. And my dad said, that's the bomb that blew out the window that Chuck Kohler was sitting next to. And the next thing that happened, he said, that guy's in a lot of trouble. He should have dropped the sandbag on the ship, not the hangar. But then when the hangar blew up, he looked at his friend and he said, that guy's in a hell of a lot of trouble now. You know, still thinking that it was one of our planes. And then he said right after that, the next plane flew over his head and he saw the big red meatball on the fuselage. And of course they knew what was going on. But I've got a very I've always, when my dad shared this story with me, I've always had a real sneaking suspicion that he very possibly could have seen the very first bomb drop. And
Well,
you confirmed it in your presentation because you talked about the hangar being the targets as they came in.
And you're exactly correct, because Chuck Kohler contends that the first bombs at Pearl Harbor were dropped near Building 58. And it was just really amazing to be able to interview him.
Yeah, so anyway, if I, at some point, if I can get your email address or whatever, I'll send you stuff, but if you're interested.
Oh, I definitely am. In fact, I'd like to get together with you as well. In fact, did you say your dad was in the Black Cat Squadron?
What happened was, shortly after that, the Mad Cat stands for magnetic.
Okay.
They look for submarines with magnetic, it was a new squadron that they put together at over here at Alameda in San Francisco when he was at Alameda. And he was training for the Mad Cats, and they ended up being sent to Iceland to look for subs in the Atlantic. And then they flew down to Pembroke Dock in Wales, which is where they flew out of that. And then they flew down past the Bay of Biscay to the Mediterranean, to the Gibraltar, the opening to the Mediterranean there. And his squadron, and then they parked their planes in North Africa, Morocco, and the Mad Cats flew back and forth across the opening of the channel there into the Mediterranean, and they ended up getting 4 German submarines by the end of the war. And he got a distinguished flying. His squadron did, not him necessarily, himself. They actually sunk 1 sub, and they spotted 3 others that subs had to come up. They had to surface, and as soon as they came up to surface, then the Navy ships or the British ships or whatever took them under tow. But they were credited with the capturing 4 German submarines, sinking 1 of them.
Wow.
Had a lot that he didn't talk about it much, the greatest.
Of course not. Yeah, it's true.
He didn't talk about it much with me, but when I came home from Vietnam, and we shared a couple of war stories, and then I learned a little bit more about what he ended up putting 20 years in the Navy. He retired in 1962. We lived in Coronado. I went to Coronado High School, and he passed away in 2015, December 30th, 2015, 2 weeks after my mother passed away. 98.
Well, I want to definitely get together for sure.
Yeah, I'll put you guys together on email, and then you can work out an in-person meeting.
Where are you, Gary? Where are you now?
I saw Dave Kaiser's hat with USC on it. I want to comment too, is that I mentioned Lou Contour. He was also a Trojan, and he was personal friends with the greatest childhood actor of all time, who was my dental patient, Shirley Temple. And I don't bring that up to brag about it, but out of coincidence.
Wow.
Shirley Temple was my neighbor
Really?
when she looked nothing like in the movies though. She was very, very, she was kind of she had kind of became very good size.
Good knowledge, friend.
But
Denise and Jimmy have a hand up. Let's hear their question.
Hi, Gary.
Hey, Jimmy.
How are you?
Good, and yourself?
Good, wonderful. Denise
Thanks for
and
being
I
on
were
board.
just at Pearl Harbor in September. I wish we could go there with you someday. I wish we had been able to watch this prior to going, because this was just amazing. This is one of the most amazing hours I have ever spent staring at a computer monitor. And I just want to thank you so much for everything you've done. And I'm also amazed, your sports knowledge just blows me away. But now this is just amazing. Thank you for what you've done. This was just incredible.
Wow.
I can't wait to go back there again, knowing what I know now. That's just a lame reason to want to go back to Honolulu anyway, but it just gives me so much more to look forward to when we do go back. And thank you so much for this hour.
Well, Jimmy, I can't thank you enough, being a dear friend that you are. And this is, like I say, it was a labor of love. And I used my sports knowledge and transferred over to the history, and it kind of meshes. And so remembering all the facts and I really appreciate it coming from you. Thank you so much. Appreciate
Pete
it.
and I just discussed this the other day. There's nothing you don't know.
No.
Thank you.
Just ask my wife.
Well,
Thank you.
well,
You bet. Thank you.
thank you, Jim. Betty, you have a question for Gary?
Yes, yes, I do. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Betty.
Marino here. Will you be sending us a link so that we can share this with other people, Gary? It was wonderfully done. Thank you so much.
I'll turn that. Thanks, Betty. And for people on the call, Betty and I go back to the 3rd grade. So she was around in 1957 when I was reading that book at Arcadia
Wow.
at Highland
Right.
Oaks. So she's a doll. Thank you, Betty. You're always in my court. Tom Graves will go ahead. I think you're putting it on YouTube or whatever, so it'll be available, Betty or Tom.
It will be. PT Brent and I are working on that together. As soon as it's
Thanks, Brent.
as soon as it's up there, Gary, certainly I'll let you know. If you can let Betty and your other friends know, that'd be great. And our mutual friend Ron Chan, who helped Gary today with his presentation, has offered to give me a little help posting this recording. So hopefully that'll be done soon.
And I'm also going to give another shout out, because he deserves a round too. And that is Ron Chan and his incredible work on putting this all together for me. And words just can't describe it. Very grateful.
YouTube has a system where you can put a group of emails there and keep adding to them and have be kind of established.
Yeah, that's the idea. And God willing, that's what we're going for, PT.
Gary, did you? I'm not sure. I might have missed it, but did you know there's a baby aboard the Utah?
Yes, I knew that. Mhm.
That's quite
Very good
something.
knowledge.
Well,
I would love to be able to get out to that memorial, but you have to have connections, I think.
No, there's I think we could set that up. If you
Oh,
wanted
wow.
to.
That'd be great.
And,
I look forward to coming and visiting you next time.
There's not much there, right? You can't
No.
really go aboard the wreck,
No,
but you could get up next to it in a boat. That's the extent of the visit.
correct.
Well, the Navy did send divers aboard, and the baby's ashes were in a locker of a seaman, and they wanted to know if they wanted him to bring the ashes back, and he said no. I want to. The seaman said, I know. I want to leave my daughter there with all my shipmates.
Wow. So why were the baby's ashes on board?
Because they're waiting till they got to sea, and they would have a little ceremony and bury him at sea.
I see.
Famous story.
Oh, not new to me today. Thank you, gentlemen.
Oh, and by the way, the with regards to the last 2 survivors on the Arizona, they will not be interned in the hull of the Arizona. They've chose to be buried stateside. So all of the sailors that are going to have been entombed at the Arizona, it's done.
Everybody probably knows there's a special inscription, and they put him. I think it's a gun turret number 2, Gary.
Correct.
Put the ashes in there.
Mhm.
You know, quite a ceremony.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, the leader of the first flight, the Tora Tora guy, what was his
Fuchida.
name and how did he die?
Fuchida actually survived the war, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And he lived a very long life. I can't tell you exactly what he died from, but he lived well into old age. And he was very fortunate to survive the tragedy.
He didn't have a Toyota dealership in Pismo Beach.
No, he remained in Japan. Probably had a dealership there.
I heard that he was also first off the flight deck at Midway.
Is that right, Glenn? Oh,
That's
wow.
what I heard, yeah.
Thanks for coming on, Glenn. I appreciate it.
Been here,
First off the flight deck. Oh, on the aircraft carrier, or where?
yes, the first to attack Midway.
Oh,
So he's on Akagi, maybe that, well, the first one went down was the Akagi at Midway. So maybe that. I might say too, Glenn Barnett's on the call. He's been very helpful to me with some terrific articles on the Vestal, but you should read some of his articles on B-17s, World War II. Honored to have him on, and thank you, Glenn, for coming today.
Happy to do it.
Glenn, maybe you can pick an appropriate topic and join us as a speaker next time.
Sure. If Gary, give him my email and we'll be in touch.
Will do.
Thank you.
Glenn, you're former military?
No, I had polio as a boy, iron lung, the whole thing. So I set out the military.
You had polio, you and FDR.
Yeah.
I will say this, when Glenn and I first met, he was kind enough to be at one of the veterans' homes. And the fellow I interviewed was a B-17 tail gunner, volunteered to be a tail gunner, and was on 35 missions in World War II.
Yeah. He
In the
flew over Normandy on D-Day, and then he flew to the Ukraine on another part of Operation Frantic.
Whoa.
And tell him about the 34th mission that he sat out.
Well, they flew the one plane. It was called Full House because the tail numbers had 3 7s and 2 4s. And most of the missions were flown in that plane. But on the 34th mission, another crew took it up and they were shot down.
Whoa. Wow. Lawrence, did you have a question for Gary?
Oh, there's Lawrence. Here he is.
Yeah.
Hi, Lawrence.
You need
Questions.
to. Oh, there you go. Okay.
No questions.
Hi,
No,
Lawrence.
okay.
How are you? Good to see you. We just talked about you.
Yes, thank you.
Here's the man right here, ladies and gentlemen, a veteran, World War II, over 100 years old.
Wow.
No,
Bless you
90
today.
Thank you, sir. I tell you, whenever I hear the term Mitsubishi Zero, the next thought in my adult mind is you don't see many World War II Marines driving Mitsubishis.
Oh,
Uh,
I bought a Lexus one time in San Francisco, and I have several Marines in my company, and I had about 6 months of nonstop abuse. I finally got rid of it. I gave it away to somebody in the company. It was I'll give you a remark. I never thought PT Brent would drive a Jaf car.
well,
You know about the Zero, I mentioned earlier, it was the most produced aircraft in World War II, and I think there were over 11,000. There are only 2 left today that can fly.
oh,
And one of them is at the Plains of Fame down in Chino, California.
oh,
I think we have one on an exhibit at the Air Museum here in Hawaii.
Seen it. It's good.
And
Yeah.
you know what else is really missing that never has been saved is the Pan Am clipper ship. Those luxury, they have, one of the hotels has a replica of it in the top in Hong Kong, but we don't have anything. The Pan Am clipper ship should be rebuilt or something.
Can I interject along those lines? I'm glad you brought that up because Bob Dunlap, the 8.5-year-old, when I interviewed him, I asked him, I said, what was it like in the late 1930s when you had the Lure line and the Matson lines coming in? And then I said, oh, it was great because he did a shoe shine business at 5 cents a job. And he just loved it when they came in. And I said, what about the Pan Am Clippers? And then he beamed up and he goes, oh my goodness. He says, you can't imagine walking inside the cabins of those planes.
They had each one had separate bedrooms enclosed, and then they had another area for dining. Of course, they only went about 130 miles an hour or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It was quite a trip from the West Coast.
And their history with Wake Island's pretty worth a special story too.
Yeah, exactly.
they didn't have much of a range from here to Tokyo. Might have been half a dozen stops or more.
Right. That's why Wake Island was there.
Plus, you had to have special fuel for those planes as well. But our PBYs could go 16 hours in the air and about 2,500 miles.
Yeah,
Well,
that was very,
do we have any PBYs on exhibit anywhere?
Yes, there's one up at the PBY Museum. I've seen that up at Whidbey Island in Washington. You can tour that. There's a museum it's called the College Foundation. They were the ones that, remember the first B-17 that went down 2019, and they resurrect old aircraft, but they're working on one there.
Well,
And you know, we lost a B-17 just recently in Dallas, Texas. You saw that.
no.
Yeah, it was a resurrect one, and a Cobra flew into it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So,
Steve,
I just,
you'll be
my
the last question, okay?
yeah, my father was on Midway on December 7th, and I'm just wondering if you have done any work on the history of Midway and interviewed it.
actually, I went down to the Midway conference on board the USS Midway in San Diego. Now, that ship was not in existence at the time of the Battle of Midway. It was at the end of the war, and at the time it had the longest flight deck of any carrier in existence. So they have a ceremony down there. It just so happens that there were two of them. One was 100 and the other one was 106. And I got to interview both those guys. One was a tail gunner on a torpedo bomber TBF, and the other one was torpedo handler, ordnance man. And they were both supposedly on the Hornet.
Have
Yeah,
you
my
been to-
father was on the hangar
Okay.
as a member of the gun crew when the Japanese shell hit the hangar
Oh, wow. And this is where, at Midway?
on Midway Island.
Oh, Midway. Wow. Yeah.
have you been on Midway, Gary?
I have not. I have
There's
not.
the military tours, historical tours, I think makes an annual trip there. I think it was somebody told me when that was the very first Medal of Honor recipient in World War II was at Midway.
Yeah.
I will tell you that John Finn, who I have talked about today, he was at Kaneohe Naval Air Station and was shot up 21 times. The two
Right.
waves that came over, and he was the first, what I've read anyway, the first Medal of Honor recipient in the Pacific War.
And you're right. You're right. They have his name is Finn, Finn.
Finn,
I
exactly.
think the one at Midway was a Marine, the first Marine.
Mhm. Yeah,
I
and
was
in
Stan.
fact, here's another little story. If you saw the movie Midway, Earl McCluskey got most of the pub on this because he was in a dive bomber, led the attack, and he supposedly took out two of the carriers on one day. But there's another fella, Dusty Kleiss, who flew with him. He's written a book called "Don't Call Me Hero." Excellent book to read. It reads like fiction, and he also dropped two that day. Never gets any credit for it. And Carl Stewart, who's on the line here, his neighbor was the daughter, Jill Kleiss, and I got to interview her. And so we both came to the conclusion that Dusty got short shrift as far as the movie is concerned. But nevertheless, he is a hero.
Wow. What's Dusty's last name?
Kleiss, Kleiss. And the name of the book is Don't Call Me Hero. And it reads like fiction. It's a terrific book.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Steve, do you have any photos from your dad, Steve, from Midway?
Yes, I do have some photos. Yes.
I'd like to see him.
Absolutely.
I also have his diary that he kept on Midway.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So I'll make sure you guys get to connect.
Gary,
Yes.
it's Denise. My
Hi,
dad
Denise.
was, hi, my dad was at the Battle of Midway. He joined he joined the Navies and then was put in the Marines right after Pearl Harbor. And he was a meteorologist.
Huh.
He never talked about it, but I have his scrapbook. I'm going to get it out and look and see what I can share with you.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely. Yeah.
He was there, and then he was where was he else? In Japan? No.
China.
China. He was in China. And my mom, and then he married my mom, who was also a Marine.
I do have one question really quick.
Sure.
Mopar Ranch.
Yes.
Can you get me information for that gentleman?
Oh, absolutely. He's on the call here, Terry
Oh.
Ulmer, and he is amazing. And you definitely should go see that.
He has a collection of Mopars.
Yes, he does.
I have a 68 Hemi Roadrunner.
No kidding.
Yes. I mean, no, I'm not kidding.
Wow. Well, he'll
Wow.
take you on a tour of his, he's got it's a 77 Green Barracuda. Classic color. And when he goes out driving, he's got an outfit in his trunk. Everything's the same color as the color of the paint of the car. It's amazing.
Limelight green.
Exactly. You
Yep.
good knowledge. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Cool.
I'll get you connected.
Perfect. Thank you.
I want to say another thing about Midway. While I'm here, Ron Chan, who's sitting right next to me, his father was post-battle, but served at Midway later in the war.
Well, oh, Gary, I don't know if you know, but well, every year, years ago, they would have a Midway reunion all over the United States. And one year they had it in Carson City, and my dad was in charge of it. And Jimmy and I went up, and two other couples that were also in the Marines, including my parents, all renewed their wedding vows at this Midway reunion. It was really cool.
Wow. Very special. Very, very special. Wow.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Gary.
Thank you guys for being on.
Thank you.
Gary, thank you. I think I don't have to tell you how enthusiastic and thankful we all are that you shared your knowledge with us today. And I want to thank everybody, frankly, on the call, those of us who are interested in the history of our country and history of those who came before us. You recognize how important people like Gary are in collecting those histories for us and for future generations. So with that, I'm going to stop our recording. And if you all want to chat for another few minutes, that's fine. It's 1:45 in San Francisco. And Gary knows I have a dentist appointment in an hour, but you can still visit a little bit if you like.